Assalamu alaikum, welcome to my channel. In this presentation, I will talk about the skull. The skull forms the skeleton of the head and also the skeleton of the face. The skull is not formed of a single bone, but it is formed of about 22 bones. 21 bones articulate with each other to form this ball-like structure, which is named the cranium. And there is only a single separate bone which is named the mandible. So the skull is formed of cranium and mandible. The mandible will be discussed later in another video. In this presentation, I will start talking about the cranium. For the best description of the cranium, we have to take a number of views. Each view will be named Norma. When you look to the skull vertically from above to see the superior surface or the superior aspect of the skull, this view is named Norma verticalis. When you look to the skull from the front, this view will be named Norma frontalis. When you look to the skull from the back of the skull is named, or this view will be named Norma occipitalis. When you look to the side of the skull, as in this view is named Norma lateralis. So we have two Norma lateralis, one for the right side of the skull, right Norma lateralis, and left Norma lateralis for the left side of the skull, as this one. This is the base of the skull. You can take two views for the base of the skull. You can take a view for its external surface or its inferior surface. This view will be named Norma basalis externa. And you can remove this part of the skull, which is named the skull cap, to see the base of the skull from inside the skull. You will see the superior surface of the base of the skull from inside. And this view will be named Norma basalis interna. So finally, we will have 6 views: Norma verticalis, Norma frontalis, Norma occipitalis, Norma lateralis, Norma basalis externa, and Norma basalis interna. In each norma, we will focus on 3 items. The first item will be the bones forming the norma, the bones which articulate with each other to form the norma. The second point will be the sutures or the joints where 2 or more bones articulate. The third point will be what are the features of the bones. Now let's start with the simplest view, Norma verticalis, the superior view of the skull. At first, we will identify that this is the nose, so this is the front and this is the back. What are the bones which appear in Norma verticalis? Anteriorly, you can see this large bone, which forms the forehead and lies in the front, so it will be named frontal bone. Posteriorly, you can see this bone, which is named occipital bone. Occipital means the back of the skull. Between the frontal bone anteriorly and the occipital bone posteriorly, you can see this bird bone. This bone is named parietal bone. We have right parietal bone and left parietal bone. So the bones which appear in Norma verticalis are frontal bone anteriorly, occipital bone posteriorly, right and left parietal bones which form the sides of the skull. The next item will be the joints or the sutures formed between the bones. We have to know that when 2 bones articulate or meet with each other and the gap between them is filled with fibrous tissue, this type of joint will be named fibrous joint. Fibrous joints are found in the body at various sites, but in the skull they have a unique feature and they are named sutural joints. Why they are named sutural joint? When you look to the 2 parietal bones, for example, you can notice that each one sends projections like the teeth of a comb towards the other, which results in a zigzag-like structure, which looks like a suture. So this type, the fibrous joint in the skull, will be named sutural joints. We can notice that there is a transverse suture which runs between the frontal bone anteriorly and the two parietal bones posteriorly. This suture is named coronal suture. Then we can see that the two parietal bones are separated by a suture which runs in the midline. This suture will be named sagittal suture. And posteriorly we can see a suture which looks like an inverted V. This suture separates the two parietal bones anteriorly from the occipital bone posteriorly, and it is named lambdoid suture. So we have three sutures. This suture, the coronal suture, which lies at the site where you put the crown and separates the frontal bone from the two parietal bones. Then in the midline, the sagittal suture between the two parietal bones. Then posteriorly, the lambdoid suture between the two parietal bones and the occipital bone. What are the features of the bones? When you look to the frontal bone, you can notice this part, which is the most convex part. It will be the most prominent part, and it is named frontal eminence. Eminence means elevation. Similarly, you can see that this part of the parietal bone is the most convex or the most prominent part. It will be named parietal eminence. And you can see here on each side of the sagittal suture a small foramen in each parietal bone. These foramina are named parietal foramina. Each one lies about 1 centimeter lateral to the sagittal suture. When you pass forward with the sagittal suture, you will see that it meets the coronal suture in a point. This point is named bregma. Posteriorly, the sagittal suture meets the lambdoid suture in a point. This point is named lambda. Let's see bregma and lambda in the fetal skull. This is the fetal skull. The site of the bregma and the lambda are occupied with membranes. The bones in Norma verticalis are first formed of membranes, and with development, primary ossification centers appear at the center of each bone, and the process of ossification starts and spreads from the center of the bone towards the periphery, leaving membranous gaps between the bones. We have 6 gaps in the fetal skull. 2 are single and appear in Norma verticalis. At the site of the bregma, there is a membrane named anterior fontanelle. At the site of the lambda, there is a membrane named posterior fontanelle. Other fontanelles will appear in Norma lateralis. When we compare the anterior and the posterior fontanelles, we can see that there is a difference in the shape. The anterior fontanelle is diamond shaped, while the posterior fontanelle is triangular in shape. The anterior fontanelle closes about 1.5 years to 2 years after birth, while the posterior fontanelle is closed at birth, or it takes about 3 to 6 months to close after birth. Now let's see Norma occipitalis, the posterior view of the skull. At first, what are the bones which form Norma occipitalis? Superiorly, we can see that these are the 2 parietal bones. We can see the posterior parts of the 2 parietal bones in Norma occipitalis, while their anterior parts appear at Norma verticalis. Then below the two parietal bones, we can see this large bone, which is named occipital bone. On each side of the occipital bone, we can see this bone. This bone is named mastoid part of temporal bone. There is a bone named temporal bone, which appear in Norma lateralis. Part of it lies behind the ear and appears in Norma occipitalis. This part is named mastoid part of temporal bone. Inferiorly, it projects downward like the nipple, and this nipple-like projection will be named mastoid process. So the bones in Norma occipitalis are posterior parts of the two parietal bones superiorly, occipital bone inferiorly, and on each side mastoid part of temporal bone. What about the sutures? We can see in the midline here the sagittal suture between the two parietal bones. Then we can see the inverted V-shaped lambdoid suture. Then the lambdoid suture becomes continuous with two sutures. One passes transversely outward between the parietal bone above and the mastoid part of the temporal bone below. This suture is named parieto-mastoid suture. The lambdoid suture is also continuous with this suture, which passes downward and separates the occipital bone medially from the mastoid part of temporal bone laterally. So this suture will be named occipito-mastoid suture. So the sutures again: posterior part of the sagittal suture, lambdoid suture, parieto-mastoid suture, occipito-mastoid suture. And finally, what are the features of the bones forming Norma occipitalis? We can notice again the two parietal foramina. We saw them before in Norma verticalis, and we also can see them in Norma occipitalis. We can also see the point of meeting between the sagittal suture and the lambdoid suture, which is the lambda. The lambda marks the site of the posterior fontanelle in the fetal skull. Then, when we descend to the occipital bone, we notice that this part of the bone is smooth and flat. So it will be named squamous part of occipital bone. Squamous means flat. At the center of the occipital bone, there is a prominent elevation. This elevation is named external occipital protuberance. Protuberance means a large elevation, and external occipital means that this elevation lies on the outer surface of the bone. Then, from the external occipital protuberance, there is an elevated ridge or line which descends in the midline. This elevated ridge is named external occipital crest. We can see at the sides elevated ridges or lines passing laterally towards the mastoid part of the temporal bone. These lines lie in the back of the neck, which is named nuchal region. So they will be named nuchal lines. This line, which passes laterally from the external occipital protuberance, will be named superior nuchal line, while this one, which passes laterally on each side from the middle of the external occipital crest, will be named inferior nuchal line. In few skulls, you can see a third nuchal line, which lies here about 1 centimeter above the superior nuchal line. This line is faint and is named the highest nuchal line. So the nuchal lines are 3 on each side: the highest nuchal line, the superior nuchal line, and the inferior nuchal line. When you look to the back of the mastoid part of temporal bone, you can notice here a small foramen. This foramen lies just lateral to the occipitomastoid suture and is named mastoid foramen. Thank you.